Zimbabwe constitutional lawyer and governance expert is back in the studio with me. Brian, welcome back. Let's talk about that. I mean, it seems like the opposition has finally found its voice. People are mobilizing, people are unifying. But we were talking about this earlier. Who would be the right people to lead Zimbabwe into a new transitional government? Is it the current ZANU-PF leaders that feature Mnangagwa, and of course the leaders that we know have been Mugabe's allies, or the opposition members that have never been given the chance? According to you, Brian, what do you think?
I think ideally it would have been the opposition.
Yeah.
Realistically, I think you do need a conglomeration of forces.
A sort of coalition.
You need a coalition. You need in a transitional phase. You do need all the opposition players.
To show inclusiveness, so to say, Brian.
And also they bring competencies that are different. So some are young and energetic. The technocratic competencies are much higher.
Yeah.
Some are old and experienced. The understanding of statecraft is much deeper and broader. The country at the moment must not, or rather it must resist the temptation of a triumphalism where one person wins, takes everything and runs away. Because if that happens, the fallout in less than 2 years is going to be phenomenal. I think that the Zimbabweans who gathered on the street, whilst Mugabe symbolized the things they were unhappy about, it is the system. It is the system and the political culture that had entrenched itself within ZANU. An arrogance of the rulers or the governors towards the governed. An inattentiveness to the plight of ordinary folk on the street. So I think that if Mnangagwa wishes to delink himself from the historical legacy that linked him to brutality, to insensitivity, he of necessity, if he is going to be confirmed as leader, must have a broad church. He must bring on board sentiments he may not agree with, diversity he may not be comfortable with, but that which is necessary to move the country forward. But within ZANU-PF itself, ZANU-PF needs to come to a stage where they de-escalate the sort of toxic fights that have gone. Otherwise, those who are vanquished today will become tomorrow's renegades.
Absolutely.
And will want to avenge themselves.
Yes.
So it is important as a country actually for us to move towards not just a truth and reconciliation, but a truth and justice process. We must ask, because ours has been a hurtful, painful past. Under Rhodesian rule, racism, dehumanization, dispossession. Under Mugabe's rule, the first 20 years, the ethnic dimension to the politics, the genocidal acts of the government within Matabeleland, and post-2000, the violence against members of the opposition and pro-democracy protesters. So we need to come to a stage as a nation where we say, okay, we are a hurting people. We have a wounded leadership, as one colleague once said. And this leadership and the people need to come to a place of healing. We cannot heal by sweeping things under the carpet, by using power and might to avert and avoid accountability. We cannot heal by simply engaging in a euphoric, or we have gotten rid of the prime evil. What was evil about Zimbabwe may have been epitomized by a person, and it's easy to target a person as a symbol of struggle. But the same way in South Africa, apartheid was not just one man. Apartheid was a system that embedded itself in the economy, embedded itself in society, in the attitudes and ways in which people were dehumanized every day. ZANUism was not just an individual. It was not just a party. It was the attitude of access to and exercise of power that saw this entitlement to loot and do so with impunity. This entitlement to treat people like trash and get away with it. This entitlement to use your village, your family, as the premise of accumulation. You promote people who are not competent simply because they are loyalists. We cannot go back to that politics. And for me, the leader who must take Zimbabwe forward, and if it is Emmerson Mnangagwa, he needs to be magnanimous. Magnanimous and gracious in victory, because if he is not, his own end will be as pitiful as Mugabe's end.
Let's talk about Mnangagwa further there, Brian. I mean, this conversation that he's supposedly having with Robert Mugabe, that he's totally refused to be privy to or party to, saying that he refuses to engage with him because it's the voice of the people of Zimbabwe that have spoken to Mugabe. It's not a problem amongst the two leaders. Do you think he's now just taking the easy way out and saying, and pursuing his presidential ambitions, he does not care about the fact that he's been very pivotal in Mugabe's rule and reign?
There's a thin line between love and hate.
True.
Until Grace's ambitions overshadowed Mnangagwa. You go to the 2014 Congress where Joyce Mujuru was deposed.
Yeah.
The rise of Mnangagwa as the chosen son, and how he spoke about his mentor, even in giving interviews to the British and other international journals. It would be, I think, dishonest for Mnangagwa or for any other citizen to assume that what we are witnessing is not simply a father and son relationship that has gone horribly wrong. And what has gone wrong is a dispute over inheritance. That the father, instead of leaving the person who saw themselves as the firstborn son, a country as an inheritance, had decided to leave his junior wife, right? And for us as Zimbabweans, we've been dragged into a family feud that has gone terribly wrong. However, as Zimbabweans, we can seize this opportunity. Seize this opportunity because every opportunity in any social setting must be seized. In seizing this opportunity, we must remind ourselves, it is not choosing the father or the son in the dispute. It is choosing those fundamental principles that constitute the essence of who we are as a people. Highly competent, highly literate, hardworking, and yet living in a country which is endowed with great natural resources. And yet we live, we're the scorn of the earth. We live as beggars in other countries, in our own country. We barely can get an economy working. How do you get some of the most brilliant minds on the continent failing to get basics of an economy right? And I'll tell you how. When governance is the preserve of a few people who can do so with impunity, and who have monopoly over capacity to tell lies, monopoly over coercive arms of state, which is violence, who control almost everything that defines citizenship, that defines nationhood. Persons who govern on the basis of sectarian interests are not alive to the diversity of our country of 11 ethnic groups. People who are not alive to the fact that generationally, over 85% of Zimbabweans are under the age of 35. Only 4% are over the age of 64. So there is a consciousness that must arise in all of us. And I do not think that the young generation must necessarily say we don't need the old generation, or the old generation feel that because they liberated the country from colonial rule, they're entitled to rule until they go to the grave.
But this is the impasse, Brian, that, we were talking about this very same point yesterday, that, a lot of people feel that loyalty to the so-called liberation movement. And even if it does wrong, people will still, because I was asking, why did the Zimbabwean people still vote Mugabe into power after everything that had happened? And the analysts were saying, because this is the liberation movement and people don't want to accept change. But how do you then go about into a new regime if you don't want to engage in change?
I think the analysts may have oversimplified the issues. We took over independence in 1980. We had a genuine threat to constitutional order arising out of the regime here in South Africa, right? And because of that, the growth of the securocratic state, security as a primary concern of the Zimbabwean leadership, seemed justifiable. Of course, it mutated into the genocidal acts in Matabeleland. And as happened, the geo-economic and geopolitical factors, that means the interest of the rest of the world in Zimbabwe, whether it's natural resources, whether Zimbabwe as a secondary interest point, because they wanted to checkmate some of the South African liberation movements, was a key. Our history was not simply shaped by irrationality. Our history was shaped by the context of SADC, and Mugabe is a creature of his moment. So I would say to you that perhaps the reason why Zimbabweans voted Mugabe out in 2000, Zimbabwe voted Mugabe out in 2008, the military refused. So it is not the failure of citizens to vote him out. It is the capacity of the coercive arms of state to alter citizen views, citizen intentions, citizen sovereign will. And unfortunately, in the region which was preoccupied with stability, any notion that Mugabe has been voted out by a pro-democracy movement that they viewed as a proxy of imperial interests became problematic. Whether that judgment had any basis at all seems problematic. So what was Morgan being punished for, Tsvangirai? Because there were some whites who seemed to be supporting him. It is ironic that the moment of ascendancy of Mnangagwa, you had a lot of white people on the streets. Had this been for Morgan, we would have dismissed this as purely an imperial design against the revolution. And here is the irony of the moment, that the very politics of inclusiveness that many of the ZANU people were now praise singing, stepping over each other in order to sound loyal to this change momentum, were themselves visceral in the attack of any appearance of white folk. So we defined nation in very limited, narrow terms. We defined citizenship in very limited, narrow terms. And it is this moment is about redefining that citizenship. But this moment is not just about pontification and constitutional matters. This moment is about the realism of how do we construct an inclusive future as Zimbabweans. There are strong judgments we have of each other. Strong judgments based on the history of the last 37 years or even longer. My sense is that we would be foolish as Zimbabweans if we built monuments around our differences and we did not actually ask ourselves, where do we have common ground around values? What is it that we agreed needs to change with our governance? What is it that Mnangagwa is willing to say sorry for to Zimbabweans? Because he's not a new entrant. He's been in this platform for a long time. Yes, some Zimbabweans will say thank you to him and Chiwenga for their contribution today. But they must have the decency of saying to Zimbabweans, we are sorry we were part of denying you. If in 2000 we had allowed your sovereign will to survive, the country would not have been in this state. And ZANU would have had a democratic way of renewing itself and realizing where there was a gap between the liberation movement and the people.
But I also hear that, Zimbabwe's democratic system is one of the best, but it's your judicial bodies that are weakened, therefore not allowing for the law or the human rights to be effected properly. So what do you think for the new transitional government should be the main focus as they take over, if they take over?
We do have brilliant judges, and I think sometimes when we comment on the compromises in the judiciary, we tend to generalize. There are some brilliant judges who are very independent and competent. On political matters, though, there's been a tendency developed over years for judges to be cautious in their judgment and not to be seen to be against. So if a court case were to be raised now, I doubt that the judges would have the courage to rule against Mnangagwa or Chiwenga. And that caution is understandable because it seems that public sentiment is in one direction, military might is in one direction. The principled nature of a judicial body, the ability to stand even against common sentiment, is something that needs to be nurtured again. The Zimbabwean judiciary in the 80s, when ZAPU people were being arrested, ruled against Mugabe. So people create this impression that there was never a moment when the Zimbabwean judiciary ruled against the regime. No, it's not true.
But this, I raised the question in relation to the fact that elections, people there were allegations of rigged elections, and I was asking then, why couldn't people bring these issues like we've seen in Kenya to the courts?
And I think it's twofold. I did the elections, some of the petitions in 2000 were open. The machinery of rigging and its sophistication in Zimbabwe, the capacity of the opposition to monitor elections across the country. In Kenya, the military did not, until recently, and the police act as necessarily aligned to the ruling party, therefore stopping opposition from accessing rural areas, right? The securitization of or securocratic state in Zimbabwe was such that opposition could not access rural areas. That meant that if you tried to go and monitor and observe elections in rural areas, you were at a high risk, right? So often you would know the election was rigged, but that ability to gather sufficient evidence, especially in the rural areas. So even when there was violence, opposition folk and civil society raised those matters with SADC. SADC's position was, well, there were problems here and there, but this election represents a legitimate expression of the will of the people. And I wish that President Mbeki could sit in this moment amongst other luminaries of SADC at the moment and realize that decisions not made 15 years ago or 20 years ago are what is costing Zimbabwe now. And it is useful that pragmatism is not substituted for principle.
I want us to wrap this discussion with another point in our neighbors also there, Brian. I mean, on that very same issue, what do you make of the Supreme Court's ruling on the petitions against Kenyatta's re-election?
It was going to be a difficult ruling in any event.
Absolutely.
Difficult for two reasons. That there was a boycott, but the boycotters also acted to stop people from going to the polls. So in essence, when you approach the court, you must do so with clean hands. From a political perspective, one understands why people who are boycotting the court because they feel that the conditions are not conducive should take action to try and stop people from legitimating an illegitimate process. However, at law, the difficulty, I have not seen the reasons for the court judgment. The difficulty that you have is you cannot rely on a breach that you have caused or contributed to.
Yeah.
You cannot found your action on the basis of that. But Kenya has more complex things than the legal niceties. The broader issue in Kenya is, and I hope the leadership of Kenya, the ones who have benefited from the current Supreme Court judgment and the opposition will realize this, that the structural and historical grievances of Kenyans are not going to go away because of a ruling of a Supreme Court. That the need for Kenyans to find each other and find what their common interests and acknowledge the deprivations, acknowledge the exclusions, acknowledge the privilege accumulated over history is important. Kenya has been a victim of two families, the Odingas and the Kenyattas. And this feud in Kenya is a feud of two families, and it's been the same feud since Kenyan independence. And what has happened is the rest of the grievances of the rest of the population have been added onto an underlying feud amongst these two families. So the Supreme Court ruling, I'm quite sure, is going to have its disputants and its supporters.
All right. One more thing from you before I let you go, Brian. I mean, we've heard the resolution that Troika meeting didn't even last 3 minutes because everybody decided that President Zuma should just go and see for himself what's happening in Zimbabwe. Once again, that whole thing of what powers do the regional bodies have, and I mean, what kind of power can they exert by being on the ground?
The two people who are important in your life, one is an undertaker, the other is a marriage officer. The marriage officer does not create the marriage, they simply ceremonize it. The undertaker does not create the death, they simply attend to it. SADC often is in this invidious position where whatever has happened within Zimbabwe, it is playing the ceremonial role. Either is an undertaker or marriage officer. We will know by the end of tomorrow what role it is decided to play.
Thank you so much for that sound analysis. Joining me in studio, that was Mr. Brian Kagoro, a Pan-Africanist Zimbabwe constitutional lawyer, as well as governance expert, deliberating everything that has been happening in Zimbabwe. We do bring you more roading updates right here on SABC News today. Let's take a quick ad break. More news after that.